Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Part 2, Chapter 15, Accident or Incident. The next day, the 22nd of March, at 6 in the morning, preparations for departure were begun. The last gleams of twilight were melting into night. The cold was great. The constellations shone with wonderful intensity. In the zenith glittered that wondrous Southern Cross, the polar bear of Antarctic regions. The thermometer showed 120 below zero. And when the wind freshened, it was most biting. Flakes of ice increased on the open water. The sea seemed everywhere alike. Numerous blackish patches spread on the surface, showing the formation of fresh ice. Evidently, the southern basin, frozen during the 6 winter months, was absolutely inaccessible. What became of the whales in that time? Doubtless, they went beneath the icebergs, seeking more practicable seas. As to the seals and morses, accustomed to live in a hard climate, they remained on these icy shores. These creatures have the instinct to break holes in the ice field and to keep them open. To these holes they come for breath. When the birds, driven away by the cold, have emigrated to the north, these sea mammals remain sole masters of the polar continent. But the reservoirs were filling with water, and the Nautilus was slowly descending. At 1,000 feet deep it stopped. Its crew beat the waves, and it advanced straight towards the north at a speed of 15 miles an hour. Towards night, it was already floating under the immense body of the iceberg. At 3 in the morning, I was awakened by a violent shock. I sat up in my bed and listened to the darkness, when I was thrown into the middle of the room. The Nautilus, after having struck head, rebounded violently. I groped along the partition and by the staircase to the saloon, which was lit by the luminous ceiling. The furniture was upset. Fortunately, the windows were firmly set and had held fast. The pictures on the starboard side, from being no longer vertical, were clinging to the paper, whilst those of the port side were hanging at least a foot from the wall. The Nautilus was lying on its starboard side, perfectly motionless. I heard footsteps and a confusion of voices, but Captain Nemo did not appear. As I was leaving the saloon, Ned Land and Conseil entered. "What is the matter?" said I at once. "I came to ask you, sir," replied Conseil. "Confound it!" exclaimed the Canadian. "I know well enough. The Nautilus has struck, and judging by the way she lies, I do not think she will right herself as she did the first time in Torres Straits." "But," I asked, "has she at least come to the surface of the sea?" "We do not know," said Conseil. "It is easy to decide," I answered. I consulted the manometer. To my great surprise, it showed a depth of more than 180 fathoms. "What does that mean?" I exclaimed. "We must ask Captain Nemo," said Conseil. "But where shall we find him?" said Ned Land. "Follow me," said I to my companions. We left the saloon. There was no one in the library. At the center staircase, by the berths of the ship's crew, there was no one. I thought that Captain Nemo must be in the pilot's cage. It was best to wait. We all returned to the saloon. For 20 minutes we remained thus, trying to hear the slightest noise which might be made on board the Nautilus, when Captain Nemo entered. He seemed not to see us. His face, generally so impassive, showed signs of uneasiness. He watched the compass slightly, then the manometer, and going to the planisphere, placed his finger on a spot representing the southern seas. I would not interrupt him, but some minutes later, when he turned towards me, I said, using one of his own expressions in the Torres Straits, "An incident, Captain?" "No, sir. An accident this time." "Serious?" "Perhaps." "Is the danger immediate?" "No." "The Nautilus has stranded?" "Yes." "And this has happened how?" "From a caprice of nature, not from the ignorance of man. Not a mistake has been made in the working, but we cannot prevent equilibrium from producing its effects. We may brave human laws, but we cannot resist natural ones." Captain Nemo had chosen a strange moment for uttering this philosophical reflection. On the whole, his answer helped me little. "May I ask, sir, the cause of this incident?" "An enormous block of ice, a whole mountain, has turned over," he replied. When icebergs are undermined at their base by warmer water, or reiterated, shocks, their center of gravity rises, and the whole thing turns over. This is what has happened. One of these blocks, as it fell, struck the Nautilus, then, gliding under its hull, raised it with irresistible force, bringing it into beds, which are not so thick, where it is lying on its side. "But can we not get the Nautilus off by emptying its reservoirs, that it might regain its equilibrium?" "That, sir, is being done at this moment. You can hear the pump working. Look at the needle of the manometer. It shows that the Nautilus is rising. But the block of ice is floating with it, and, until some obstacle stops its ascending motion, our position cannot be altered." Indeed, the Nautilus still held the same position to starboard. Doubtless it would right itself when the block stopped, but at this moment, who knows if we may not be frightfully crushed between the two glassy surfaces. I reflected on all the consequences of our position. Captain Nemo never took his eyes off the manometer since the fall of the iceberg. The Nautilus had risen about 150 feet, but it still made the same angle with the perpendicular. Suddenly, a slight movement was felt in that hold. Evidently, it was righting a little. Things hanging in the saloon were sensibly returning to their normal position. The partitions were nearing the upright. No one spoke. With beating hearts, we watched and felt the straightening. The boards became horizontal under our feet. 10 minutes passed. "At last we have righted!" I exclaimed. "Yes," said Captain Nemo, going to the door of the saloon. "But are we floating?" I asked. "Certainly," he replied, "since the reservoirs are not empty, and when empty, the Nautilus must rise to the surface of the sea." We were in open sea, but at a distance of about 10 yards, on either side of the Nautilus, rose a dazzling wall of ice. Above and beneath the same wall. Above, because the lower surface of the iceberg stretched over us like an immense ceiling. Beneath, because the overturned block, having slid by degrees, had found a resting place on the lateral walls, which kept it in that position. The Nautilus was really imprisoned in a perfect tunnel of ice more than 20 yards in breadth, filled with quiet water. It was easy to get out of it by going either forward or backward, and then make a free passage under the iceberg, some hundreds of yards deeper. The luminous ceiling had been extinguished, but the saloon was still resplendent with intense light. It was the powerful reflection from the glass partition sent violently back to the sheets of the lantern. I cannot describe the effects of the voltaic rays upon the great blocks so capriciously cut. Upon every angle, every ridge, every facet was thrown a different light, according to the nature of the veins running through the ice. A dazzling mine of gems, particularly of sapphires. There blue rays crossing with green of the emerald. Here and there were opal shades of wonderful softness, running through bright spots like diamonds of fire, the brilliancy of which the eye could not bear. The power of the lantern seemed increased 100-fold, like a lamp through the lenticular plates of a first-class lighthouse. How beautiful! How beautiful! Cried Conseil. Yes, oui, oui, I said. It is a wonderful sight, is it not, Ned? Yes, confound it, yes, answered Ned Land. It is superb. I am mad at being obliged to admit it. No one has ever seen anything like it. But the sight may cost us dear, and if I must say all, I think we are seeing here things which God never intended man to see. Ned was right. It was too beautiful. Suddenly, a cry from Conseil made me turn. Aïe! What is it? Qu'est-ce que c'est? I asked. Shut your eyes, sir. Do not look, sir. Saying which, Conseil clapped his hands over his eyes. What is the matter, my boy? I am dazzled, blinded, allure. My eyes turned involuntarily towards the glass, but I could not stand the fire which seemed to devour them. I understood what had happened. The Nautilus had put on full speed. All the quiet luster of the ice walls was at once changed into flashes of lightning. The fire from these myriads of diamonds was blinding. It required some time to calm our troubled looks. At last, the hands were taken down. Faith, I should never have believed it, said Conseil. It was then 5 a.m, and at that moment a shock was felt at the bows of the Nautilus. I knew that its spur had struck a block of ice. It must have been a false maneuver, for this submarine tunnel, obstructed by blocks, was not very easy navigation. I thought that Captain Nemo, by changing his course, would either turn these obstacles or else follow the windings of the tunnel. In any case, the road before us could not be entirely blocked. But contrary to my expectations, the Nautilus took a decided retrograde motion. We are going backwards? Said Conseil. Yes, I replied. This end of the tunnel can have no egress. And then? Then, said I, the working is easy. We must go back again and go out at the southern opening. That is all. In speaking thus, I wished to appear more confident than I really was, but the retrograde motion of the Nautilus was increasing, and reversing the screw it carried us at great speed. It will be a hindrance, said Ned. What does it matter? Some hours more or less, provided we get out at last. Yes, repeated Ned Land, provided we do get out at last. For a short time I walked from the saloon to the library. My companions were silent. I soon threw myself on an ottoman and took a book, which my eyes overran mechanically. A quarter of an hour after, Conseil approaching me, said, Is what you are reading very interesting, sir? Yes, very interesting, I replied. I should think so, sir. It is your own book you are reading. My book? Mon livre? And indeed, I was holding in my hand the work on the great submarine depths. I did not even dream of it. I closed the book and returned to my walk. Ned and Conseil rose to go. Stay here, my friends, said I, detaining them. Let us remain together until we are out of this block. As you please, sir, Conseil replied. Some hours passed. I often looked at the instruments hanging from the partition. The manometer showed that the Nautilus kept at a constant depth of more than 300 yards. The compass still pointed to the south. The log indicated a speed of 20 miles an hour, which in such a cramped space was very great. But Captain Nemo knew that he could not hasten too much, and that minutes were worth ages to us. At 25 minutes past 8, a second shock took place, this time from behind. I turned pale. My companions were close by my side. I seized Conseil's hand. Our looks expressed our feelings better than words. At this moment, the captain entered the saloon. I went up to him. Our course is barred southward? I asked. Yes, sir. The iceberg has shifted and closed every outlet. We are blocked up then? Yes. Chapter 16. Want of Air. Thus, around the Nautilus, above and below, was an impenetrable wall of ice. We were prisoners to the iceberg. I watched the captain. His countenance had resumed its habitual imperturbability. Imperturbable. Unable to be upset or excited. Calm. His countenance had resumed its habitual imperturbability. Gentlemen, he said calmly, there are two ways of dying in the circumstances in which we are placed. This puzzling person had the air of a mathematical professor lecturing to his pupils. The first is to be crushed. The second is to die of suffocation. I do not speak of the possibility of dying of hunger, for the supply of provisions in the Nautilus will certainly last longer than we shall. Let us, then, calculate our chances. As to the suffocation, Captain, I replied, that is not to be feared because our reservoirs are full. Just so, but they will only yield 2 days' supply of air. Now, for 36 hours we have been hidden under the water, and already the heavy atmosphere of the Nautilus requires renewal. In 48 hours, our reserves will be exhausted. Well, Captain, can we be delivered before 48 hours? We will attempt it, at least, by piercing the wall that surrounds us. On which side? Sound will tell us. I am going to run the Nautilus aground on the lower bank, and my men will attack the iceberg on the side that is least thick. Captain Nemo went out. Soon I discovered by a hissing noise, hiss, that the water was entering the reservoirs. The Nautilus sank slowly and rested on the ice at a depth of 350 yards, the depth at which the lower bank was immersed. My friends, mon ami, I said, our situation is serious, but I rely on your courage and energy. Sir, replied the Canadian, I am ready to do anything for the general safety. Good, Ned! And I held out my hand to the Canadian. I will add, he continued, that being as handy with the pickaxe as with the harpoon, if I can be useful to the captain, he can command my services. He will not refuse your help. Come, Ned! I led him to the room where the crew of the Nautilus were putting on their cork jackets. I told the captain of Ned's proposal, which he accepted. The Canadian put on his sea costume and was ready as soon as his companions. When Ned was dressed, I re-entered the drawing room where the panes of glass were open and posted near Conseil. I examined the ambient beds that supported the Nautilus. Some instants after, we saw a dozen of the crew set foot on the bank of ice, and among them Ned Land, easily known by his stature. Captain Nemo was with them. Before proceeding to dig the walls, he took the soundings to be sure of working in the right direction. Long sounding lines were sunk in the side walls, but after 15 yards they were again stopped by the thick wall. It was useless to attack it on the ceiling-like surface, since the iceberg measured more than 400 yards in height. Captain Nemo then sounded the lower surface. There 10 yards of wall separated us from the water. So great was the thickness of the ice field. It was necessary, therefore, to cut from it a piece equal in extent to the water line of the Nautilus. There were about 6,000 cubic yards to detach, so as to dig a hole by which we could descend to the ice field. The work had begun immediately and carried on with indefatigable energy. Instead of digging round the Nautilus, which would have involved greater difficulty, Captain Nemo had an immense trench made at 8 yards from the port quarter. Then the men set to work simultaneously with their screws on several points of its circumference. Presently, the pickaxe attacked this compact matter vigorously, and large blocks were detached from the mass. By a curious effect of specific gravity, these blocks, lighter than water, fled, so to speak, to the vault of the tunnel, that increased in thickness at the top in proportion as it diminished at the base. But that mattered little, so long as the lower part grew thinner. After 2 hours' hard work, Ned Land came in exhausted. He and his comrades were replaced by new workers, whom Conseil and I joined. The second lieutenant of the Nautilus superintended us. The water seemed singularly cold, but I soon got warm handling the pickaxe. My movements were free enough, although they were made under a pressure of 30 atmospheres. When I re-entered after working 2 hours to take some food and rest, I found a perceptible difference between the pure fluid with which the roll engine supplied me and the atmosphere of the Nautilus, already charged with carbonic acid. The air had not been renewed for 48 hours, and its vivifying qualities were considerably enfeebled. However, after a lapse of 12 hours, we had only raised a block of ice 1 yard thick on the marked surface, which was about 600 cubic yards. Reckoning that it took 12 hours to accomplish this much, it would take 5 nights and 4 days to bring this enterprise to a satisfactory conclusion. 5 nights and 4 days, and we have only air enough for 2 days in the reservoirs. Without taking into account, said Ned, that even if we get out of this infernal prison, we shall also be imprisoned under the iceberg, shut out from all possible communication with the atmosphere. True enough. Who could then foresee the minimum of time necessary for our deliverance? We might be suffocated before the Nautilus could regain the surface of the waves. Was it destined to perish in this ice tomb? With all those it enclosed? The situation was terrible. But everyone had looked the danger in the face, and each was determined to do his duty to the last. As I expected, during the night, a new block, a yard square, was carried away, and still further sank the immense hollow. But in the morning, when dressed in my cork jacket, I traversed the slushy mass at a temperature of 6 or 7 degrees below zero. I remarked that the side walls were gradually closing in. The beds of water farthest from the trench that were not warmed by the men's work showed a tendency to solidification. In presence of this new and imminent danger, what would become of our chances of safety, and how hinder the solidification of this liquid medium? What would burst the partitions of the Nautilus like glass? That would burst the partitions of the Nautilus like glass. I did not tell my companions of this new danger. What was the good of damping the energy they displayed in the painful work of escape? But when I went on board again, I told Captain Nemo of this grave complication. "I know it," he said, in that calm tone which could counteract the most terrible apprehensions. "It is one danger more, but I see no way of escaping it. The only chance of safety is to go quicker than solidification. We must be beforehand with it. That is all." On this day, for several hours, I used my pickaxe vigorously. The work kept me up. Besides, to work was to quit the Nautilus, and breathe directly the pure air drawn from the reservoirs and supplied by our apparatus, and to quit the impoverished and vitiated atmosphere. Towards evening, the trench was dug 1 yard deeper. When I returned on board, I was nearly suffocated by the carbonic acid with which the air was filled. If we had only the chemical means to drive away this deleterious gas! We had plenty of oxygen. All this water contained a considerable quantity, and by dissolving it with our powerful piles, it would restore the vivifying fluid. I had thought well over it, but of what good was that, since the carbonic acid produced by our respiration had invaded every part of the vessel? To absorb it, it was necessary to fill some jars with caustic potash and to shake them incessantly. Now this substance was wanting on board, and nothing could replace it. On that evening, Captain Nemo ought to open the taps of his reservoirs and let some pure air into the interior of the Nautilus. Without his precaution, we could not get rid of the sense of suffocation. The next day, March 26th, I resumed my miner's work in beginning the 5th yard. The side walls and the lower surface of the iceberg thickened visibly. It was evident that they would meet before the Nautilus was able to disengage itself. Despair seized me for an instant. My pickaxe nearly fell from my hands. What was the good of digging if I must be suffocated, crushed by the water that was turning into stone? A punishment that the ferocity of the savages even would not have invented. Just then, Captain Nemo passed near me. I touched his hand and showed him the walls of our prison. The wall to port had advanced to at least 4 yards from the hull of the Nautilus. The captain understood me and signed me to follow him. We went on board. I took off my cork jacket and accompanied him into the drawing room. "Monsieur Aronnaud, we must attempt some desperate means, or we shall be sealed up in this solidified water as in cement." "Yes, but what is to be done?" If my Nautilus was strong enough to bear this pressure without being crushed." "Well?" I asked, not catching the captain's idea. "Do you not understand," he replied, "that this congelation of water will help us? Do you not see that by its solidification it will burst through this field of ice that imprisons us, as when it freezes it bursts the hardest stones? Do you not perceive that it would be an agent of safety instead of destruction?" "Yes, Captain, perhaps. But whatever resistance to crushing the Nautilus possesses, it could not support this terrible pressure and would be flattened like an iron plate." "I know it, sir. Therefore we must not reckon on the aid of nature, but on our own exertions. We must stop this solidification. Not only will the side walls be pressed together, but there is not 10 feet of water before or behind the Nautilus, the congelation gains on us on all sides. How long will the air in the reservoirs last for us to breathe on board? The captain looked in my face. After tomorrow, they will be empty. A cold sweat came over me. However, ought I to have been astonished at the answer? On March 22nd, on March 22, the Nautilus was in the open polar seas. We were at 26 degrees. For 5 days we had lived on the reserve on board, and what was left of the respirable air must be kept for the workers. Even now, as I write, my recollection is still so vivid that an involuntary terror seizes me, and my lungs seem to be without air. Meanwhile, Captain Nemo reflected silently, and evidently an idea had struck him, but he seemed to reject it. At last, these words escaped his lips. "Boiling water," he muttered. "Boiling water?" I cried. "Yes, sir. We are enclosed in a space that is relatively confined. Would not jets of boiling water, constantly injected by the pumps, raise the temperature in this part and stay the congelation?" "Let us try it," I said resolutely. "Let us try it, Professor." The thermometer then stood at 7 degrees outside. Captain Nemo took me to the galleys, where the vast distillatory machines stood that furnished the drinkable water by evaporation. They filled these with water, and all the electric heat from the piles was thrown through the worms bathed in the liquid. In a few minutes this water reached 100 degrees. It was directed towards the pumps, while fresh water replaced it in proportion. The heat developed by the troughs was such that cold water, drawn up from the sea after only having gone through the machines, came boiling into the body of the pump. The injection was begun, and 3 hours after the thermometer marked 6 degrees below zero outside. 1 degree was gained. 2 hours later, the thermometer only marked 4 degrees. "We shall succeed," I said to the captain, after having anxiously watched the result of the operation. "I think," he answered, "that we shall not be crushed. We have no more suffocation to fear." During the night, the temperature of the water rose to 1 degree below zero. The injections could not carry it to a higher point, but as the congelation of the seawater produces at least 2 degrees, I was at least reassured against the dangers of solidification. The next day, March 27, 6 yards of ice had been cleared, 12 feet only remaining to be cleared away. There was yet 48 hours' work. The air could not be renewed in the interior of the Nautilus, and this day would make it worse. An intolerable weight oppressed me. Towards 3 o'clock in the evening, this feeling rose to a violent degree. Yawns dislocated my jaws. My lungs panted as they inhaled this burning fluid, which became rarefied more and more. A moral torpor took hold of me. Torpor, a state of physical or mental inactivity, lethargy. A moral torpor took hold of me. I was powerless, almost unconscious. My brave Conseil, though exhibiting the same symptoms and suffering in the same manner, never left me. He took my hand and encouraged me, and I heard him murmur, "Oh, if I could only not breathe so as to leave more air for my master." Tears came into my eyes on hearing him speak thus. If our situation to all was intolerable in the interior, with what haste and gladness would we put on our cork jackets to work in our turn. Pickaxes sounded on the frozen ice beds. Our arms ached. The skin was torn off our hands. But what were these fatigues? What did the wounds matter? Vital air came to our lungs. We breathed. We breathed. All this time, no one prolonged his voluntary task beyond the prescribed time. His task accomplished, each one handed in turn to his panting companions the apparatus that supplied him with life. Captain Nemo set the example and submitted first to this severe discipline. When the time came, he gave up his apparatus to another and returned to the vitiated air on board, calm, unflinching, unmurmuring. On that day, the ordinary work was accomplished with unusual vigor. Only 2 yards remained to be raised from the surface. 2 yards only separated us from the open sea, but the reservoirs were nearly emptied of air. The little that remained ought to be kept for the workers, not a particle for the Nautilus. When I went back on board, I was half suffocated. What a night! I know not how to describe it. The next day my breathing was oppressed. Dizziness accompanied the pain in my head and made me like a drunken man. My companions showed the same symptoms. Some of the crew had rattling in the throat. On that day, the 6th of our imprisonment, Captain Nemo, finding the pickaxes work too slowly, resolved to crush the ice bed that still separated us from the liquid sheet. This man's coolness and energy never forsook him. He subdued his physical pains by moral force. By his orders, the vessel was lightened, that is to say, raised from the ice bed by a change of specific gravity. When it floated, they towed it so as to bring it above the immense trench made on the level of the waterline. Then, filling his reservoirs with water, he descended and shut himself up in the hole. Just then, all the crew came on board, and the double door of communication was shut. The Nautilus then rested on the bed of ice, which was not 1 yard thick, in which the sounding leads had perforated in 1,000 places. The taps of the reservoirs were then opened, and 100 cubic yards of water was let in, increasing the weight of the Nautilus to 1,800 tons. We waited. We listened, forgetting our sufferings in hope. Our safety depended on this last chance. Notwithstanding the buzzing in my head, I soon heard the humming sound under the hull of the Nautilus. The ice cracked with a singular noise, like tearing paper, and the Nautilus sank. "We are off," murmured Conseil in my ear. I could not answer him. I seized his hand and pressed it convulsively. All at once, carried away by its frightful overcharge, the Nautilus sank like a bullet under the waters. That is to say, it fell as if it was in a vacuum. Then all the electric force was put on the pumps that soon began to let the water out of the reservoirs. After some minutes, our fall was stopped. Soon, too, the manometer indicated an ascending movement. The screw, going at full speed, made the iron hull tremble to its very bolts and drew us towards the north. But if this floating under the iceberg is to last another day before we reach the open sea, I shall be dead first. Half stretched upon a divan in the library, I was suffocating. My face was purple, my lips blue, my faculties suspended. I neither saw nor heard. All notion of time had gone from my mind. My muscles could not contract. I do not know how many hours passed thus, but it was conscious of the agony that was coming over me. I felt as if I was going to die. Suddenly, I came to. Some breaths of air penetrated my lungs. Had we risen to the surface of the waves? Were we free of the iceberg? No. Ned and Conseil, my two brave friends, were sacrificing themselves to save me. Some particles of air still remained at the bottom of one apparatus. Instead of using it, they had kept it for me, and while they were being suffocated, they gave me life, drop by drop. I wanted to push back the thing. They held my hand, and for some moments I breathed freely. I looked at the clock. It was 11 in the morning. It ought to be the 28th of March. The Nautilus went at a frightful pace, 40 miles an hour. It literally tore through the water. Where was Captain Nemo? Had he succumbed? Were his companions dead with him? At the moment, the manometer indicated that we were not more than 20 feet from the surface. A mere plate of ice separated us from the atmosphere. Could we not break it? Perhaps, in any case, the Nautilus was going to attempt it. I felt that it was in an oblique position, lowering the stern and raising the bows. The introduction of water had been the means of disturbing its equilibrium. Then, impelled by its powerful screw, it attacked the ice field from beneath like a formidable battering ram. It broke it, backing and then rushing forward against the field, which gradually gave way. And at last, dashing suddenly against it, shot forwards on the ice field that crushed beneath its weight. The panel was opened. One might say torn off, and the pure air came in abundance to all parts of the Nautilus. Chapter 17. From Cape Horn to the Amazon. How I got on to the platform, I have no idea. Perhaps the Canadian had carried me there. But I breathed. I inhaled the vivifying sea air. My two companions were getting drunk with the fresh particles. The other unhappy men had been so long without food that they could not, with impunity, indulge in the simplest elements that were given to them. We, on the contrary, had no end to restrain ourselves. We could draw this air freely into our lungs, and it was the breeze alone, that filled us with this keen enjoyment. "Ah," said Conseil, "how delightful this oxygen is! Master need not fear to breathe it. There is enough for everybody." Ned Land did not speak, but he opened his jaws wide enough to frighten a shark. Our strength soon returned, and when I looked round me, I saw we were alone on the platform. The foreign seamen in the Nautilus were contented with the air that circulated in the interior. None of them had come to drink in the open air. The first words I spoke were words of gratitude and thankfulness to my two companions. Ned and Conseil had prolonged my life during the last hours of this long agony. All my gratitude could not repay such devotion. "My friends, mon ami," said I, "mes amis, we are bound one to the other forever, and I am under infinite obligations to you, which I shall take advantage of," exclaimed the Canadian. "What do you mean?" said Conseil. "I mean that I shall take you with me when I leave this infernal Nautilus." "Well," said Conseil, "after all this, are we going right?" "Yes, I replied, "for we are going the way of the sun, and here the sun is in the north." "No doubt," said Ned Land, "but it remains to be seen whether he will bring the ship into the Pacific or the Atlantic Ocean, that is, into frequented or deserted seas." I could not answer that question, and I fear that Captain Nemo would rather take us to the vast ocean that touches the coasts of Asia and America at the same time. He would thus complete the tour round the submarine world and return to those waters in which the Nautilus could sail freely. We ought, before long, to settle this important point. The Nautilus went at a rapid pace. The polar circle was soon passed, and the course shaped for Cape Horn. We were off the American point, March 31st, at 7 o'clock in the evening. Then all our past sufferings were forgotten. The remembrance of that imprisonment in the ice was effaced from our minds. We only thought of the future. Captain Nemo did not appear again either in the drawing room or on the platform. The point shown each day on the planisphere, and marked by the lieutenant, showed me the exact direction of the Nautilus. Now, on that evening, it was evident, to my great satisfaction, that we were going back to the north by the Atlantic. The next day, April 1st, when the Nautilus ascended to the surface some minutes before noon, we sighted land to the west. It was Terra del Fuego, which the first navigators named thus from seeing the quantity of smoke that rose from the natives' huts. The coast seemed low to me, but in the distance rose high mountains. I even thought I had a glimpse of Mount Sarmiento, that rises 2,070 yards above the level of the sea, with a very pointed summit, which, according as it is misty or clear, is a sign of fine or of wet weather. At this moment the peak was clearly defined against the sky. The Nautilus, diving again under the water, approached the coast, which was only some few miles off. From the glass windows in the drawing room, I saw long seaweeds and gigantic fuki and varech, of which the open polar sea contains so many specimens, with their sharp, polished filaments. They measured about 300 yards in length. Real cables, thick than one's thumb, and having great tenacity, they are often used as ropes for vessels. Another weed known as velp, with leaves 4 feet long, buried in the coral concretions, hung at the bottom. It served as nest and food for myriads of crustacea and mollusks, crabs, and cuttlefish. Their seals and otters had splendid repasts, eating the flesh of fish with sea vegetables according to the English fashion. Over this fertile and luxuriant ground the Nautilus passed with great rapidity. Towards evening it approached the Falkland group, the rough summits of which I recognized the following day. The depth of the sea was moderate. On the shores our nets brought in beautiful specimens of seaweed and particularly a certain fucus, the roots of which were filled with the best mussels in the world. Geese and ducks fell by dozens on the platform and soon took their places in the pantry on board. When the last heights of the Falklands had disappeared from the horizon, the Nautilus sank to between 20 and 25 yards and followed the American coast. Captain Nemo did not show himself. Until the 3rd of April, we did not quit the shores of Patagonia, sometimes under the ocean, sometimes at the surface. The Nautilus passed beyond the large estuary formed by the Uruguay. Its direction was northwards, and followed the long windings of the coast of South America. We had then made 1,600 miles since our embarkation in the seas of Japan. About 11 o'clock in the morning, the Tropic of Capricorn was crossed on the 37th meridian, and we passed Cape Frio standing out to sea. Captain Nemo to Ned Land's great displeasure, did not like the neighborhood of the inhabited coasts of Brazil, for we went at a giddy speed. Not a fish, not a bird of the swiftest kind could follow us, and the natural curiosities of these seas escaped all observation. This speed was kept up for several days, and in the evening of the 9th of April we sighted the most westerly point of South America that forms Cape San Roque. But then the Nautilus swerved again and sought the lowest depths of a submarine valley which is between this cape and Sierra Leone on the African coast. This valley bifurcates, bifurcate, divide into two branches or forks. This valley bifurcates to the parallel of the Antilles and terminates at the mouth by the enormous depression of 9,000 yards. In this place, the geological basin of the ocean forms, as far as the Lesser Antilles, a cliff to 3.5 miles perpendicular in height, and at the parallel of the Cape Verde Islands, on other wall not less considerable, that encloses thus all the sunk continent of the Atlantic. The bottom of this immense valley is dotted with some mountains that give to these submarine places a picturesque aspect. I speak, moreover, from the manuscript charts that were in the library of the Nautilus, charts evidently due to Captain Nemo's hand, and made after his personal observations. For 2 days the desert and deep waters were visited by means of the inclined planes. The Nautilus was furnished with long diagonal broadsides which carried it to all elevations. But on the 11th of April it rose suddenly and land appeared at the mouth of the Amazon River, a vast estuary, the embouchure of which is so considerable that it freshens the seawater for the distance of several leagues. Side note, 8 paragraphs are deleted from this edition. End side note.